So, Bill, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the Greco-Turkish War,
Okay.
which is also known as Kurtuluş Savaşı in Turkey.
Yes.
So, you seem to know a lot about it, so I'd like to hear what you have to say,
Okay.
starting with how the Greek army ended up in Smyrna.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, after World War I ended, the Greeks were promised concessions for their participation in World War I at the expense of the Ottoman Empire.
So the British and the French promised them.
With mostly the British. The ones who were supposed to have occupied Smyrna were actually the Italians. And they were kind of side railed to their dismay. They weren't happy. They were the ones who were promised Smyrna originally. But because the Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos was such a charismatic politician, great speaker, he was able to convince the British to occupy the former Ottoman lands because the British army at that point was really tired, and they would have needed about 1 million men to occupy the Ottoman or the former Ottoman Empire. So the Greeks, having historical claims to the region, dating back to Alexander the Great, jumped at the opportunity to implement what was then known as the Great Idea. So Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos offered his services, and the British agreed to allow the Greeks to land an expeditionary force or an occupying force in Smyrna under the pretext to protect the Greek Christian population and to police the zone. And then after 5 years, there would be plebiscite that they could annex it to Greece. So the army landed on May 15th of 1919, and which caused a nationalist fervor that the Turks had never seen. And then on May 19th of 1919, Pasha Mustafa Kemal landed on the shores of Samsun, and thus began the nationalist movement to create the country of Turkey. So the Greeks were occupying Smyrna beginning in 1919. And then in 1920, because there were bands of irregular Chets that were fighting back and they were harassing the Greek troops, the Greek army decided to fan out in 1920, which was called the 1920 Summer Offensive. They reached as far as Bursa, Ayadin, Philadelphia. And so thus their zone was extended beyond the Milne line, named after General Milne. As the occupation progressed, the nationalist movement got stronger and stronger and stronger. And the Greeks found themselves in a position where they had to put more and more resources into the occupation and into the destruction of the nationalist movement. So
what is going on in mainland Greece at this time? Because
in mainland Greece, there was elections that were held in November of 1920, where the prime minister lost.
Venizelos lost.
Yes, and I believe the same year, I don't remember if it's before or after, Prince Alexander, who was the king at the time, who was pro-Entente, who was participating in this venture, was bitten by a monkey and resulting in sepsis, and he died.
So there was actually a huge power struggle going on at the top level in Greece.
Well, not at that time, because Greece was under one government, which was Venizelos. Mm-hmm. What had happened was, because the prince or the king died, the prince died, and Venizelos lost the elections because the Greeks were tired of fighting at that point. They had been fighting since 1912, continuously, pretty much. And the mothers were tired of having their sons come back in body bags. It was draining the economy. It was really bringing Greece down.
So this was not a popular war?
It was not a popular war. And the people showed it in their votes in 1920, in November of 1920, when they ousted Prime Minister Venizelos.
So one of the main reasons Venizelos was not re-elected was because
they were tired of the war. They wanted nothing to do with it, and they wanted to bring the troops home. They wanted to get out of this venture.
Yeah.
The Greeks in Asia Minor were not really seen as Greeks to the mainland Greeks. They were a distinct society, if you will. Even when they came back after 2022, they were seen as Turkish, and they were discriminated against. They would have this nickname for them. They would call them yogurt eaters.
Yogurt eaters.
Yogurt eaters. Mm-hmm. So,
how do you say that in Greek?
Oh, I don't remember. Fagon yaourti.
Okay.
I'm just guessing. So, anyways, or yaourti fagon.
Uh-huh.
So after November of 1920, Venizelos lost, and the Greek king, Constantine, who was hated by the Entente, came back to power.
So there was actually the power struggle was during the First War between him and Venizelos.
The king lost that.
And king lost that, and he was ousted.
Prime Minister Venizelos won that struggle. When he won, he got the Greeks into World War I.
Mm-hmm. And then over to Anatolia.
Because the Allies promised Venizelos, who was a staunch nationalist, and he wanted to implement the great idea, Greece of the 5 Seas. They dangled this carrot that they said, if you enter, we will grant you concessions in Asia Minor, Smyrna, the western coast. So now that they participated, they wanted to get their reward. So the Greek army landed, as I had said, but after he had lost in 1920, the king came back and everything changed. The allies who hated the king saw that this war was dragging on. Every major power wanted a piece of the former Ottoman Empire, which they got. The French got, I believe, Syria. The British wanted Iraq. The Italians were resentful at the Greeks because they were promised Smyrna. So everybody started to back off, withdraw their support from the Greeks, and started to make side deals with Kemal. They knew that their interests could better be served by Kemal rather than through war with Greece. So the balance of power changed, the dynamic changed, and the king was left with a dilemma. Do we withdraw from Asia Minor, even though the people wanted it, but it would be a humiliating defeat. It would be a humiliation. So they took the decision to continue, to press on, to crush the nationalists once and for all.
How important was, because the year 1920 is a...
It was seen as the major turning point because two things happened. Mm-hmm. The prince died, and they say that the monkey bite that lost the war. Mm-hmm. It was from a monkey bite. And from that monkey bite, the elections were held, and Venizelos lost.
And what was going on the Turkish side at the time? Does the
Turks were getting stronger and stronger every single day, because Kemal was he was a brilliant strategist and politician, where he was able to play the Bolsheviks to his favor. The Bolsheviks had just gone through a civil war with the White Army, who was supported by the British, the Greeks, and some other force, and the French, I think. So the Bolsheviks didn't want British influence in that region. It was imperialist influence, right? So the Bolsheviks were going to try and stop this imperialist expansion at all cost. So Kemal played to that, said, look, we're nationalists, these are imperialists that are trying to take over. Help us fight them, and your southern border can be secure. So the Bolsheviks started to supply gold, weapons, support to fight the Greeks. But at the same time, in 1920, the French, who were in Cilicia, were defeated, and the Armenians by the nationalists. So once they defeated them, they could focus all of their armies against the Greeks.
On the west?
Correct.
On the west
Exactly.
front,
Yeah.
western front, yeah.
So once that happened, the king was under pressure now. We really have to try to end this with a military solution. Because every day that goes by, Kemal is getting stronger and stronger. He's organizing a regular army. He defeated the Greeks at the first battle of Inonu and the second one.
So the king, who didn't want to go into this war in the first place,
Continued it.
now end up in the middle of the war.
And everybody says in hindsight he should have stayed where he was, but he was confident because of his generals, his royalist generals, because once the king came back to power, they purged a lot of the officers or the Venizelist officers of the Greek army who had the most experience from the Balkan wars. So they kind of put lackluster, inexperienced officers because of their political affiliations, which were royalist. They weren't as competent as the Venizelist ones. So there was a purge going on there, which weakened the command structure, and leadership is everything, right? So the king decided to press on. Their initial campaign in spring of 1921 was successful. They conquered Kütahya, Eskişehir, and tried to encircle the nationalist army. And Kemal knew of the situation that was happening. His general on site wanted to continue fighting. Kemal went down to the site. He saw what was happening, and he told his troops, retreat, get out. He knew that if they were circled, they would be wiped out. So the only time that the Greeks had a chance to destroy this army was there. Kemal came in, saved it, said no, retreat. The Turks didn't want to because they had fought so hard to keep that part. He had to make the tough choice, and they went back. So that, for the Greeks, was the only chance that they had, and so the Turks avoided the pincer movement, and they escaped capture.
So that's when the Turkish army moved east of
the Sakarya. Correct.
Yeah.
So now the Greeks are like, damn, we got to continue further deep.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like Napoleon. The terrain is going to wear them down, right? Mm-hmm. So now they had to march across deserts, the salt desert, to meet the Turks at Sagarios. Their aim was to go to Ankara. Once, because that was the headquarters of.
So they didn't necessarily want Ankara, but they wanted to crush
the nationalist movement, and that was the home base. So they had to take it. So Kemal set his defensive perimeter on the east side of the Sagarios, and the Greeks marched for weeks, blazing sun, no water. They got there, and there was a 3-week pitched battles where both armies bled each other white. And the Greek king, who was fearing he would be encircled, blinked first. He lost his nerve, and he retreated. the Greeks were losing men and material at an alarming rate. The Turks were continuously getting resupplied by fresh troops. Their bases were closer than the Greeks, who were all the way in Smyrna, Eskişehir, right? So the Greeks lost. They went back to their former lines of 1921, Kütahya, Eskişehir, and they stayed there for 1 year until Kemal launched his final offensive, August 26, 1922, driving the Greeks out. But by that point, the loans to the Greeks were cut by the British because they had enough. There was no military solution for the Greeks after the Battle of Sakarya. And the Greeks tried to find a diplomatic solution, but Kemal knew that he had the upper hand. And he said, nope, we're going to drive them out. And he drove them out.
Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome.